After almost 19 years of war, we are drawing down again our troop levels in Afghanistan as President Trump tries to wage peace there. Still. Hey, everybody, I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, and this is the latest on America's longest war. Gentlemen, this headline passed by me earlier today. We're taping this on Tuesday. U.S. military spokesman in Afghanistan, Sonny Leggett, said in a statement, the military had begun its conditions-based reduction of forces. I don't even want to get into what the conditions might possibly be because they're never going to happen, to 8,600 over the next 135 days. Currently, the U.S. has about 13,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, 8,000 of whom are involved in training and advising the Afghan National Army, and about 5,000 are our own guys who are fighting for us for reasons that I don't understand anymore, really. We're predicating this on a peace deal between the Taliban and the national government, Kabul, which is never going to hold. The national government is corrupt to its core. It's never going to be loved. The Taliban sees power sharing as just a necessary step on the way to taking power again. Bill, let's start with you. President Obama called Iraq the necessary war back in his election campaign in 2000. Or excuse me, Afghanistan. Yeah, the necessary war in his 2008 first election campaign. And it was so necessary that he inserted tens of thousands more troops while announcing his own drawdown before those troops were even sent. How necessary is our war there still after all this time?
Well, we certainly learned some lessons from both Iraq and Afghanistan. One time, I think one thing that needs to be looked at, Steve, and this is the case for just about everything of importance, is you can see what happened, but you can't see what didn't happen because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is an important factor in looking at things that maybe don't appear to have been terribly either good or bad. Sometimes you look at a situation, you wonder, well, what's going on? Why did we do this? And the answer is not so much what happened as what didn't happen. Afghanistan had become a breeding ground for terrorists, most notably Al-Qaeda. You may remember, I hate to be telling tales out of school, but on our backstage show where we prepped this segment, it took Steve a moment to remember the name Al-Qaeda, and I don't blame him because the term is not in common usage anymore. And the reason the term's not in common usage anymore is because of the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, where Al-Qaeda sent most of their forces to go out and get killed in the desert by U.S. Army and Marines and not in shopping malls in America. So if you remember, and I do, if you remember the mood in this country on September 12th of 2001, we thought that we were going to see buildings going down all the time. Yep. And we thought we were going to see every single Super Bowl halftime climax in an explosion and thousands of people being carried out dead. And we thought that every car had a bomb under it. And we were not incorrect to think these things. We were facing an enemy who had shown a willingness to use our own systems against us in an ingenious way and had brought down not just 3,000 lives, but brought down the iconic skyline of our first city, arguably the most iconic part of the first city in the world. Yeah. It's not a trivial thing to react to. And so when you ask why were we there?
Oh, I didn't ask why we were there.
No, I'm getting there. I'm getting there, buddy. I understand you weren't asking why were we there. So the reasons for going to both those places were good reasons. And then the reasons for staying there were to see whether or not these cultures were capable of producing a society that would not be a future breeding ground for terrorists. And and for those people who said, no, it never could have happened, I would refer you to an internet search for what Kabul looked like in the 1950s. Yeah. It looked like Beirut in the 1950s. There were stewardesses from airlines in short skirts talking about flights to Baghdad and flights to Kabul. And there's a classic shot of a beautiful tree-lined avenue with a flower garden and all of this stuff. And today it is simply a dusty road with broken concrete, and it had been there. Comes a point, though, when you have to realize that okay, either the situation has changed or is not changeable back. There comes a point when the game is not worth the candle, as they used to say. It's no longer worth burning the candle to stay up and play a game that's just not worth playing anymore. I'm not referring to what we did in Afghanistan as a game. But clearly, I think in Afghanistan, we have long past the point of diminishing returns. And so what I think started out as a necessary action and stayed as long as it did from a noble impulse to see if we could foster, help grow, not place, but help grow something that looked like the government that had been there before the rise of militant Islam and the Taliban. And we found out that wasn't happening. It comes time to change that strategy. And pulling troops out of Afghanistan at this point, I think, is the right thing to do. But if you think that means we're done with Afghanistan, we're not. We are going to, I think, all across the board now, we've learned the lessons that many people say we should have known this going in, but we had no way of knowing this going in. And as I said, we did not see the terrorist catastrophe happen at home, not once, not a single incident of it, not one. So those missions were successful as far as I'm concerned because of what didn't happen. But what happens now, Steve, I think, is you go from a counterinsurgency strategy, which is what we've been dealing with for 20 years in Afghanistan, trying to prevent these insurgents from disrupting a new government, and realizing that's simply not working given the culture of Afghanistan. And you move from counterinsurgency to counterterrorism. And counterterrorism is entirely different. Counterinsurgency is when you basically fight to keep a government on its feet long enough to take root. That has failed in Afghanistan. Doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. Yeah. Counterterrorism is where we simply fly drones over Afghanistan, and when we see people who we know are bad people doing bad things, we just simply go in there and eliminate the problem before we lose another 3,000 Americans and buildings. And we continue to do this until this religion stops calling for the death of Americans on a daily basis. And then we can start talking about being friends again.
There you go.
But that's what I think is going on over there.
Yeah. Bill, you reminded me of something. You talked about those old photos of Kabul from the 50s and 60s. The thing to remember, though, is that scene didn't exist outside of that one or maybe two other major cities in Afghanistan. The rest,
no, absolutely.
The rest of the country it's not a country. I've been joking for years. Have you ever heard of the joke definition of a boat? It's a hole in the water surrounded by wood into which one pours money.
That's right.
Afghanistan isn't a country. It's a hole in the map surrounded by other countries into which we spent the last 19 years pouring the blood and treasure. And I honestly think it's time to stop. Scott, Bill does raise a great point, though, which is even if we pull the last boot off the ground in Afghanistan, it's going to be a long time before we're done with places like Afghanistan and the Pakistani Northwest Territories in Somalia and probably Syria as well. These places that just aren't nation states. And we're still stuck in this 1648 Treaty of Westphalia paradigm where every nation state is sacrosanct, and we don't mess with them unless we're actually at war. But pulling out of Afghanistan aside, that's a really defunct way to look at this map where terrorists can spring up almost anywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think pulling out of Afghanistan doesn't mean an end to what we are doing in Afghanistan. It just means a different place for our troops to sleep at night. I really don't think that any backing away from Afghanistan, as far as pulling those troops out, means that if we know of a terrorist den, as Bill suggested. But the challenge, to Bill's point there of bringing the drones in, is that the only way that you can be accurate with drone fire is by having assets on the ground. And those assets have to have
it's much more spycraft
trustworthy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so being able to trust your allies who are part of the Afghan army has been problematic in the past. And, by and large, we've been able to work together with them. But every once in a while, one of them turns around and shoots our troops. And so, do you trust those guys to say, hey, let us know and we'll hit that hut in the mountains because there's a terrorist leader there? Do we trust that guy is not just getting retribution for a rival, tribe or clan that he's ticked off at? And so, that becomes problematic. And what Bill started with was exactly what I was going to say. While we can be critical of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan and say, well, the Russians were there all that time and they just sacrificed a lot of blood and treasure, it's really hard to evaluate what wouldn't be there. I think the average elementary school cafeteria would probably be a bloodbath without the cafeteria monitors who stand there and make sure that everything's okay. But you don't really know, because the cafeteria monitors are always there. So it'll be a real test to see what happens. Frankly, we haven't had any kind of coherent objective there because we don't need anything. We just need to not be attacked. And so it's not like we went in there and said, well, they took our territory, so we're going to go take our territory back. I mean, we don't have an objective in Afghanistan other than don't fly planes into our buildings in the United States. Don't blow things up in Western civilization. Frankly, I think we would have been just as well off to go in there with an agenda of American cultural hegemony. I mean, I think we should have gone in there with the intention of opening within 5 years Opium Disney, where you would just go in there and say, let's just stop pussyfooting around here, because the reality is, as Bill pointed out, some of these places used to have Western mores, and let's just get them back. And I think you're good to point out the fact that the Stone Age hasn't been going on for as long as most people think it has. It's not always been horrible everywhere in the Middle East. There have been moments where it was possible to walk down the streets there and feel like you were in a modern civilized city, at least in some places. Steve is right. It's tribal cultures. It's not a nation state, but it's going to continue that way. And I think we're blinkered if we come out of there and thinking, okay, well, now American blood and treasure is safe because we no longer have 13,000 guys based in country. I think we're going to continue to have a battle there for a long time to come.
Oh, absolutely. But this idea of having a division's worth of troops on the ground in Afghanistan, it's absolutely insane to me. After all this time,
Steve, I'm sorry. Can I throw one more thing in there, because I know I've gone on way too long. But
no.
This sounds really heinous to say, but there is some value to having troops in a war zone rather than at stateside bases or in places like West Germany. There is some value to having troops who are always actively engaged in a place where combat is likely. It develops the next generation of wartime leaders, because inevitably a war will come along. And if you go for a long time without any kind of real battlefield experience, then you get rusty.
I want to add something to that, if you don't mind, Steve. I don't want you to lose control of your episode here or anything, but this is a critical,
every couple of weeks.
It's a critical point that Scott raised. We spent this money and this treasure and all of these losses and so on in Afghanistan and Iraq. But aside from the things that didn't happen, we did gain invaluable experience. We have the only battle-hardened army on the planet. And the real catastrophe, was that during 8 years of the Obama administration, it was determined to make life in the military so unbearable for actual warfighters that rather than just cashiering them, which would be politically unacceptable, I can't tell you how many warfighters I have met who simply could not bear to remain in a military that was run along these principles of political correctness and so on. This is another reason why Donald Trump's reelection, or election at least, was so important to the military. It was a retention of some of these people. And frankly, I can't think of a better dollar spent than the offer on the part of the United States military to say that if you were a member of the officer corps, or if you were in the armed forces at whatever point and you want to come back, we'll pay you for the time you were gone. I mean, you cannot replace that experience. That experience is a firsthand knowledge that is paid for in the lives of American soldiers, and it is the most precious thing that we bought in these two conflicts. And to squander that is just criminal.
It really is. It's an excellent point. Before I get to my big finish here, I want to sing the praises. I think the war has been a misguided effort for probably a dozen years now, but I want to sing the praises of the men and women who have been fighting it. Their record there is amazing. It's outstanding, with so few blemishes on the record, that it's amazing that many men and women have fought over there for so very long. It's an incredible achievement. And if you weren't able to build a statue of marble out of clay, well, that's hardly your fault. That is the fault of the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department. And those of you who fought, and even our contractors over there for years and years, you've done phenomenal work. I wish it could have turned out better than it has. As I'm reading this news, I'm thinking, though, of an essay Richard Fernandez wrote 10 years ago now called The 10 Ships. And it's a fantastic little essay. I suggest you go over to PJ Media and search for it, The 10 Ships, Richard Fernandez. He's talking about Afghanistan as though it was the place from which Yamamoto launched the fighters against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Yes, the attacks of 9/11 originated in Afghanistan, but it's not the plot of land that was the danger, just like it wasn't that nameless patch of ocean northwest of or southwest of Hawaii that was the danger. I think it was southwest. It was the 10 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kido Butai, that was the danger. As long as those 10 highly mobile aircraft carriers were out there somewhere, we weren't safe anywhere. Same thing in Afghanistan. That was the launching ground, but terrorists are highly mobile. We saw them move into Iraq. We saw them move into Syria. They've been in Somalia forever, and we've never had to commit the same number of troops to a place like Somalia as Barack Obama did in Afghanistan, which we're finally starting to wind down after all these years. It's not the land. Just like it wasn't that patch of ocean. It's the terrorists.
Good point.
Just like it's the ships. They're mobile. We go after them wherever. That's your right angle on that. Thanks for watching. I hope I didn't draw that one out too long. I'm Steve Green for Bill Whittle and Scott Ott. I'd like to remind you that content like this is made possible by the paying members of BillWhittle.com. So if you like this sort of thing, please click on over and come on board. We'd love to see you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.